here to talk about some of the things that have been occupying my attention lately. I've been watching Invincible since the first season, and I think after the second season, I was like, I cannot wait for this show to finish to get the full story. So I just went and I read the comics. So I've read all the comics, and I'm still keeping up with the show. Let me start off by just sharing some quick thoughts on Invincible. Just a spoiler warning for those who aren't up to date on season 4, particularly episode 3. In that episode, we got to see some backstory on Viltrum, right? We got a bit of backstory on the Viltrumites in seasons prior, but this episode in particular, I think it was the third episode, where we got to see some of Nolan's backstory when he was a teenager becoming a young adult and how he was kind of jumped in to their society by both of his parents beating him up brutally on his presumably 18th birthday. So we know from the show that Argall was kind of the guy responsible for developing Viltrumite culture in the direction that it went in. We don't know how long ago that was, but it seems, at least from what I could tell, that pre-Argall Viltrum may not have been an empire, right? They could have been politically and ideologically diverse, but what we saw is that a civil war, which they call the Purge, was kind of waged amongst the population through the encouragement of Argall to wipe out the quote-unquote weak. And the weak, I think, has a bit of a double entendre in that history, because I think the Viltrumites not only consider physical weakness, but also mental or ideological, philosophical weakness. And by that I mean, I think that they would view anybody who disagreed with the philosophy behind the Purge, with the philosophy behind their eugenics program, the dissidents, the protesters, the pacifists, whoever, I think they would view them as weak. And so they would have purged those people as well. And so after that purge, you have this ascendant empire. And if I'm getting the order of events correctly, the great betrayer, Thaedus, he kills Argall and then he flees, right? After he flees, the Viltrum Empire is continuing to building itself really on the backs of a slave class, as we end up seeing in that most recent episode. And I really would have appreciated seeing the perspective of the slave caste in Viltrumite society, because this is an entirely different species. I don't think they get any voice lines. We don't get to know any of their names. We don't get to learn really anything about where they came from, what species they are, how they ended up being this underclass for the Viltrumites. But anyway, so this society is continuing as it's going. We find out later that Thaedus is responsible for sending the virus, the Scourge virus, which is able to, bring Viltrumite society to its knees, right? It's essentially a genocide against the entire Viltrumite Empire, and in the end, only about 50 Viltrumites, Nolan, aka Omni-Man, among them, being left behind. And so we see the impact of the Scourge virus. We see these people, buckling, falling on their knees, crying blood. It's a really gruesome scene. We see Nolan seeing the death of his own father among the corpses that they end up tossing out into the vacuum of space, creating the ring around planet Viltrum. We also see the slaves trying their best to help their masters, even to the very end, and then often being killed themselves. In fact, in the end, the slaves seem to be wiped out by the Viltrumite society on the decline. They served the Viltrumites, but they ended up being a threat to the Viltrumites in the sense that they could spread the word to the rest of the galaxy that, hey, the Viltrumites actually do have a weakness in this virus. And so I was watching the episode, and what I ended up thinking about was the concept of blowback, strangely enough. I wouldn't say that the United States and Viltrum are comparable, and obviously the concept of blowback doesn't map one-to-one into the situation, because I think blowback generally refers to the ways that the actions of the empire in question ends up turning back around and harming that empire, but usually it's by outside forces, by external actors. Thaedus is technically an insider to Viltrumite society, or at least he used to be, so I don't know if that could be considered the same. But I wanted to talk about this concept of blowback, right? Blowback is... CIA coined the term blowback in a classified post-action report on the 1953 Iranian coup. The concept is devastatingly simple. Covert actions have unintended consequences that blow back on the country that initiated them. 7 decades later, blowback has become the defining pattern of American foreign policy, a self-perpetuating cycle in which each intervention creates the crisis that justifies the next intervention. The US armed the Mujahideen, who became Al-Qaeda, invaded Iraq and created ISIS, bombed Libya and destabilized the Sahel, armed Syrian rebels, and fueled Europe's migration crisis. And in 2026, bombed the Iranian regime that exists because of a 1953 CIA coup. Right? And this applies across history. We have the case of Iran, we have Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Guatemala, Chile, etc. And what I find interesting about, I guess, the stretch of a comparison is that, obviously 9/11 was an outcome of blowback, right? It was the actions of the US in the Middle East leading to that action being taken against the US back at home. And America is, as we know, also an empire, right? It doesn't necessarily annex countries outright, but it will exert influence directly and indirectly through military bases, through economic leverage, through institutions, the IMF and so on. And it imposes its ideology. It uses that combination of military power and soft power to exert its influence. And I think America, or rather, I think the creators of Invincible could stand to look to empires like America if they want to depict, I think, more effectively how empires actually function, right? Because the Viltrum Empire has some plot holes, I would say, in how their entire society works. I mean, they're an extremely technological society, and yes, they have the slaves there, but you can't necessarily get slaves to do certain things in a society. Or rather, I think it would be a massive vulnerability to get the slaves in their society to do certain things. So it's like, how is medical science being advanced in Viltrumite society? How is spacefaring technology being developed and upheld in Viltrumite society? How can a Viltrumite child decide, hey, I want to be a scientist in Viltrumite society, where, as we can see, Viltrumites don't even rock with their children like that. They don't really care about their children. Children kind of have to fend for themselves. How are we getting specialization when the entire society seems geared towards war, right? And so I think if they wanted to make Viltrumite society more complex and more interesting, it would look at the ways that empires actually function, taking the inspiration from the US, taking the inspiration from Rome, taking the inspiration from all these different empires across human history. Another thing I've noticed, by the way, about Viltrum as an empire is it does not seem as internally divided, at least prior to Nolan's betrayal and Mark's betrayal and, well, quote-unquote betrayal of the empire. And I guess to an extent Thaedus. Real-life empires are extremely internally divided. They have a lot of ideological variety and difference and conflict. And you could argue that all that ideological conflict was wiped out during the Purge. But then the question becomes, why doesn't new ideological dissidence develop? Why is it that with every successive generation, there aren't at least some cohort that's like, this is messed up? I mean, maybe because they are killed as children, but, in living for hundreds of years or thousands of years or however long that they live, surely at some point, some of them, back when they were in their quantities of literal billions, some of them would have formed some kind of breakaway force. Why is Thaedus the only one? I think it assumes a totalizing influence of state propaganda and conditioning that has never been the case. I mean, yes, you have these totalitarian societies that are very much capable of getting the most of their population, if not on board, then at least obedient, submissive, or whatever, going along with the program, going along with the inertia of the status quo. But even in the most effective, quote-unquote, totalitarian societies, you always have some dissident element. You always have some ideological friction and diversity. Anarchists often say that even if you kill every single anarchist, the idea of anarchy, the idea of anarchism is never going to die, because the idea of anarchism comes out of a very human impulse, which I guess maybe I should not be projecting these human impulses onto Viltrumite society. They're extremely similar to humans, but maybe they don't have the same impulses and intellectual positions and perspectives that we do, despite the apparent similarities, despite the fact that people like Nolan and Mark managed to be Viltrumite and yet not be limited by Viltrumite culture and ideology. And so I guess one last point of comparison I would make between America and Viltrum is that even after facing the consequences of their own actions, facing the scourge virus, you see that, they don't learn their lesson. they calcified their supremacist society and ideology, and they sought to destroy anyone in the galaxy that might threaten them, to kneecap them. And you see that was part of, Nolan's whole quest, was to go out and look for potential threats around the galaxy and cut them off. I think in a similar way, the US had an opportunity, has had multiple opportunities throughout its history. When it has faced the resistance of the indigenous, when it has faced the slave uprisings, when it has faced resistance of countries and societies around the Americas and around the world, when it has faced the impact of their actions, as recently as with 9/11, when with all these forever wars, to change. But structurally, the American state cannot change. Structurally, this is what it is. This is what is embedded into its ideology, into its very structure. And so the only real resolution is for the American Empire, just like the real resolution to the Viltrum Empire, is to be wiped out, to be taken out. It cannot continue. There's no reformed Viltrum Empire. There's no reformed American Empire. I just want to acknowledge again, obviously, the comparison is not one-to-one. America does not literally have like this Purge-like cultural practice where the weak are culled violently on the streets, per se. But in looking at America as, I think, a more complex and interesting empire to study, I think we can see in the relatively simplified form of that with Viltrum similar outcomes, that empires are doomed to fail sooner or later. So I read the comics, like I said, and I know where the Viltrumites are going to end up. I do look forward to seeing how it plays out on screen, what changes, if any, will be made, because they have been making changes between the comic and the show in ways that I really appreciate, especially with Debbie, with Paul, with Art, with really a lot of the characters are getting a lot more development, so I'm enjoying that. But we'll see how the Viltrum Empire falls, if it falls, when it's adapted to the silver screen. And as for the American Empire, well, I think we are seeing its fall in real time. I think the Viltrum Empire is most comparable to the Mongol Empire. That's an interesting way of looking at it. I'm not an expert on how the Mongol Empire functioned, aside from playing Crusader Kings and the one or two documentaries I may have watched. But if I remember correctly, the Mongols would have kind of adopted the administrative apparatus of whatever societies they had conquered. They would have installed themselves at the highest position of whatever state or power they would have taken over, they would have overrun, and kind of continued in that system. We see that with how they invaded China and they established their own dynasty over the Chinese Empire. We see that with, and I'm not sure, I think there was a Mongol period of rule in Iran or in Persia at one point in time. I can't remember what it was called though. I don't know if anybody in chat knows what I'm referring to. Yeah, there is, I think, some comparison to Spartan society, some inspiration there. Yeah. The show really cleaned up some pacing and characterization issues from the comic. The Omni-Man reveal and confrontation pace way better on the show. I absolutely agree. And Amber actually gets a personality, yes. So yeah, that's the Invincible yap.